It's Monday, the 9th of January. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP and former Cabinet Minister Robert Buckland, Labour MP and Shadow Justice Secretary Steve Reed, New Statesman Associate Editor Rachel Cunliffe and former Conservative advisor Salma Shah. On the programme today,
possibly a Labour government would outlaw the sale, the buying, the smoking of cigarettes eventually.
Well, the New Zealand government are doing it. We want to see how that works, but I'm genuinely curious.
Labour are talking about it. Should cigarettes be banned?
It's just a personal choice. It's about healthcare, I think, is somewhat that is private.
Does it matter if the Prime Minister uses private healthcare?
If there's no extra money, then there can't be any movement. So we'll see what we get from this meeting.
Will public sector workers be offered more money to avert further strikes? And we'll hear from the owner of a small business waiting to hear what further help she'll get with her energy bills from government. And Happy New Year, belatedly, on the first Politics Live of 2023. Welcome to you all. To start the programme, you heard the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, talking about banning smoking, or at least banning the sale of cigarettes. A good idea, Robert?
Well, I think if we focus upon the need to make sure that young people don't take up the habit, and I know in other countries they are now phasing out the sale
what New Zealand is
and
doing.
moving it up the age range so you can't buy it before 21.
Well,
that is an interesting proposal. I do think ultimately, though, with a decreasing number of people, thankfully, smoking and resorting to smoking, we are now relying on personal choice and public information and the health education I think we all are extremely aware of. I wouldn't say it's not an idea for the UK, but I think it's one that we should really be focused on children and young people and making sure they don't take up what could be a lifelong habit, which is, of course, life-limiting.
a good idea? I presume you think it is, from your colleague.
No, I mean, I largely agree with what Robert just said. I mean, what Wes didn't say we're going to ban smoking. What he said is we'll look at what's happening in New Zealand and see what we can learn from that.
But de facto it would, wouldn't it? By a certain date there...
Well, the government's got a target already to stop smoking by 2030, but it looks very unlikely they're going to meet that. And when Therese Coffey was the health secretary, she cancelled a number of the smoking cessation programmes that help people to make better choices. So, you know, I think there is a role for government in helping people, giving them information. Smoking is still the single biggest cause of cancer in our country, and that is obviously terrible for people individually, but it's also a huge drain on the National Health Service.
Should people ultimately be banned from buying cigarettes?
No. I think that there is a difference between encouraging people to make healthier choices and giving them the tools and the programmes and funding those programmes to make that possible. But if you're going to have the government ban you from doing something, there has to be very clear evidence and a very clear sort of public health and also economic case for that. And in this particular case, the argument is a little bit muddied. I think the extra work on the NHS and social care is about 3.6 billion a year. Tobacco duties bring in 10 billion a year. So that's not an argument, obviously, to encourage people to take up smoking, but it's sort of an argument against government intervention in people's lives and people's personal choices. Banning cigarettes in public places where people can't avoid second-hand smoke, very strong moral case for doing
yes.
that.
Banning people,
and it's happened. Banning people from, you know, what they choose to do with their own body, very different case.
That's interesting. I mean, it's true there are fewer people dying from smoke-related illnesses than there used to be, but as you said, it's still a significant cause of diseases like cancer, and there are still 74,600 deaths attributable to smoking, according to the NHS in 2020. Ban it or not?
No, I'm largely where Rachel is, actually, that governments shouldn't be allowed to ban anything, especially without evidence. But the logic of this is obvious. You know, we're all sat here talking about it. The Health Secretary's had a good outing, you know, the politics of this.
The Shadow Health Secretary.
Yeah, so forgive me, Shadow Health Secretary, getting ahead of myself. But the reality is that even though conceptually this is a really interesting and something that you can't really argue with policy that's being put forward, there are consequences to it. So the hole that HMRC is going to have to fill as a consequence of smoking cessation is naturally going to be a headache for the Treasury. So in order for this actually to happen, a lot of things need to happen in between. And I think this is a very good policy announcement, gets people talking, gets people thinking. But is it actually something that's going to be delivered?
Steve, do you agree with that?
Well, I do agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, you know,
so it is a talking
bad
point.
Bad start to the new year in that we're very consensual around the table here. but you know, I think we do need to keep looking at what more we can do, because the target to get people to stop smoking is a good one for people's health, but it has to be done by helping people take choices, not by forcing people to.
Well, let's see if that consensus continues with this headline in the Daily Mirror. As NHS patients suffer, one rule for the Rishi. This is Rishi Sunak refusing to say whether or not he actually is registered with a private GP or pays for private healthcare. Should he come clean, Robert?
I think this is a big red herring. I mean, you can put against that point the fact that Rishi's parents both worked in the medical profession and worked with the NHS and were part of it. And therefore, you know, you can say that he's lived with this experience and therefore knows a lot more perhaps than other people who haven't had that family experience. I don't think that's material. I think what is material is whether the government is committed to more investment in the NHS, which it clearly is, and whether it's committed to making sure that we deal with the current pressures that are particularly exacerbated by winter pressures and indeed the COVID backlog. That's how you judge a government, not on individual choices.
Right, but on that, you say he can point to his parents, as you say, family working in the NHS, so why not just come clean?
Well, look, it's a matter for him. I'm not here to, tell colleagues what to do and what to say. They've got to use their best judgment. I mean, Margaret Thatcher had private health insurance. She spoke about it. I really don't think it's material. If it was having an effect on policy, then fine, but it's not.
Does it matter?
I don't think it does. Frankly, I'm not very bothered about the decisions Rishi takes about his private life. I'm much more concerned about the fact he doesn't seem to know what's going on in the National Health Service that, the vast majority of the population are using. He keeps telling us there's not a crisis in the NHS. Well, I wonder what an NHS crisis looks like to this Prime Minister when you've got over 7 million people in waiting lists. People are dying at home because ambulances are taking hours to come. I've got constituents, elderly and very ill constituents, waiting in A&E for over 12 hours and still not being seen.
He spent all day Saturday talking about the NHS crisis.
He's telling us there's not a crisis. I wonder what he thinks a crisis looks like. Now, we're putting some proposals on the table. We would scrap non-dom status so that we could fund the biggest increase in doctors and nurses our NHS has ever seen. That would help to cut the waiting list.
But that's quite a long term, isn't it? If you're saying the crisis is now, what would you do right now? I mean, this headline in the Times says Sir Keir Starmer backs use of private sector healthcare. Right. You want more private provision.
There's spare capacity in the private health sector. So why don't we use that for the time being? I mean, the key has got to be to get people treated faster. If people are dying at home, people aren't getting into a hospital bed from A&E, we need to expand to where there is capacity and use it. And that is a plan Labour's put on the table.
I mean, should he just say it is a crisis? Rishi Sunak could sort of say the word and admit that it is a crisis.
Judging by his actions, I mean, he spent all day Saturday in Number 10 talking with other ministers and indeed with key stakeholders in the health service to talk about the very great pressures that the health service is facing. I don't think he's
not enough, is it?
But hold on, Steve. I don't think it's fair to say he's like an ostrich. He is very much aware of the problems that the NHS is facing. I'm expecting that there'll be an announcement today from the Health Secretary about more help and more investment to deal with that problem of getting people out of hospital and back into the community, which, in my hospital, 1 in 5 beds are occupied in that way. We've got to do something about it. I mean, I would be expansive, and I certainly, with the private sector, we've used it before. The booking choices that patients have in the NHS allow the private sector to be used. I'd even think about using other countries. I mean, other countries use our resources very often, particularly with mental health specialisms. Why not be expansive? Why not think expansively about dealing with this problem?
Well, before we continue on that discussion, particularly about the private sector, the issue of Rishi Sunak and whether he himself uses private healthcare. I don't know whether our two politicians have ever paid for an operation, they might like to say, or not. Is it important? No. Does it matter? Was that a no?
No. Same. Yeah.
I think it matters that he didn't have a line or an answer ready in that interview, and that he seems very cagey about it and actually seems quite irritated to be asked. If you are at a time when the NHS very clearly is in crisis, and the accusation, whether fair or not, is that the Prime Minister isn't aware or hasn't got a grip on the crisis, it's a fair question to ask. Now, he could say, yes, I do have private health insurance, or I do use the private sector because I have the resources, I have the wealth to be able to do that, and therefore take the pressure off the NHS, and actually that is a moral choice, that is a moral decision. You can make that argument. He didn't want to make that argument. He doesn't want to answer the question. And actually, when you are Prime Minister, when you are a public figure, you have to be prepared that people are going to ask, hang on, you're in charge of our public health system, you're in charge of our public education system, you don't use either. Does that mean you don't have a perspective on how bad it actually is?
I mean, you agree with that, but Salma, what's your view?
I think it's a private matter, and I think I think public figures should be allowed to have some element of privacy over what they do. I don't dispute the argument that actually, you know, when you think about his responsibilities and what he needs to consider, having some sort of perspective on how he looks at those things, you know, might be a factor. But is that really our business about the way that he conducts his own health and his own private life? I don't think that's right. And I would just say that if you get it down this argument that you need to have a perspective and a lived experience of something, then it really sort of limits what anybody can do and the decisions that anybody can make on things.
I think we should be honest about our own experience of using public services so that the public can then judge what we say about them. But I do agree that the issue here isn't whether or not Rishi Sunak uses
Steve,
the private health care.
What that does is conflate.
It's whether he understands there's a problem with the NHS.
But that conflates the idea that understanding a problem with the NHS means that you have to have had terrible experiences of it.
No, it doesn't.
I
It's
use
just
the
being open
NHS.
about your background.
I've got great experience of using the NHS. So to me, I wouldn't necessarily use the word crisis in my own experience. However, if I took a step back from this and understood what people are saying, what nurses are saying in terms of their strike action, what the numbers look like, I would say actually the NHS is going through a really difficult time.
I'm open about saying I've never used private healthcare, and that doesn't stop me coming on this show and saying that we should use spare capacity in the private sector to alleviate the pressure on the NHS.
But that works the other way. Just because the Prime Minister might or might not have used the private sector doesn't mean that his policy, therefore, is going to be influenced by that experience. And therefore, it begs the question, why are we talking about this? Let's actually talk about the issues which
I think the reason we're talking about
the issues themselves
is because he gives the impression of not fully grasping how serious the crisis is. And you talked about him spending all day on Saturday having those crisis talks. Well, the NHS has been in crisis basically since the summer. We've had repeated warnings about how bad it's getting, how bad ambulance waits are, how bad the waits at A&E are, stories about hospitals running out of oxygen, stories about patients being treated in corridors, stories about 300 to 500 people dying per week because of the delays in emergency medicine. For him to only have realised this weekend, this might be a crisis, that does speak to a lack of understanding and a lack of foresight and planning, and therefore it is acceptable to say, does this man fully grasp the state that the NHS is in?
Robert?
No, I'm sorry. I don't think that is a fair characterisation at all. I don't think the government has ever been in denial about the position with the NHS. I think, you know, that it's judge it by its actions. It's consistently increased investment. It's bringing forward a workforce strategy.
Well,
all these things are vitally
because people can't get into hospitals and people are dying at home. That is the
Steve,
results of 13 years of Tory rule.
Well, look, I'm sorry. I don't agree with that. But I am not denying at the same time that there aren't problems. Of course there are. I see it from my own casework, and I'm dealing with it on a regular basis. I was speaking to my hospital chief executive the day after New Year's Day because of the pressures on my local hospital. But if I'm experiencing, and that the Prime Minister is not living in a fantasy world, he is understanding it as well.
I mean, shouldn't people with the means to pay for private health care do so to take off some of the pressure on the NHS?
I think there's an argument for that. Unfortunately, it's wrong to think of private healthcare in this country as sort of extra capacity that doesn't get used unless people pay for it. A lot of the doctors work across both.
Indeed.
And the doctors who will treat you and put you at the front of the queue if you go private are the same ones who will treat you if you have to wait for 2 years for the same procedure.
Isn't that the issue? I mean, isn't Rachel right? We're talking about the same, broadly, the same people, the same doctors, the same nurses being stretched across both private and the NHS.
I think there's an important point underneath this, which is that we never want to go anywhere near a two-tier health service in this country, where if you're wealthy, you get a better standard of care than if you're not wealthy. We have a national health service that is free at the point of use for everybody, and that is a guiding principle of our national health service. It's why Labour's plan isn't to say the rich, the wealthy must pay to go private. It's that the state will pay to use spare capacity in the private sector and open it to everybody, because the health service, it's so fundamental, must always remain free at the point of use for everybody, or we break the NHS.
But clearly, increasing numbers of people have felt it is worth putting their hands in their own pockets to pay for private healthcare. I mean, Robert, big increase in the number of people taking out private healthcare insurance. Almost 500,000 additional people have taken out policies in the last year. Should they be discouraged from doing so?
Well, I don't think they should be discouraged, but, you know, I want to, again, an outbreak of consensus, reiterate the point that a health service free at the point of demand is the cornerstone of the NHS. However, I think there are two things here. There's the short-term challenges and then the longer-term thinking about how we fund and the way we spend our money and what the workforce is going to look like, because there's no doubt we've got big shortages in our workforce. We're asking too few people to do too much. I think that what we need to be doing now is coming together and thinking long-term across party. I hesitate to use the words Royal Commission, but I do think that we do need...
A Royal Commission for years.
Well, it doesn't have to. I know the adage is...
But they are, aren't they?
They take minutes and last years. But I think a very carefully defined set of criteria could come up with something that we can all agree on to save the long-term future of our NHS.
I mean, the thing is, Sir Keir Starmer, when he stood for the leadership a few years ago, did say something quite different in that platform. He said, as you have repeated, public services should be in public hands, but there should be an end to outsourcing in our NHS. That's different to what he's saying now.
Well, right now we're in a crisis because after 13 years of serial underfunding of our National Health Service, it's a breaking point. It's on its knees. I think 7,000 doctors last year applied for permits to work abroad. We're hemorrhaging staff because of the state of the National Health Service. Right now there's a crisis. I wish Rishi Sunak would stand up and recognise that fact, because this is why these other issues about his use of private healthcare keep arising. Does he recognise that a crisis is a crisis or not? You know, it's almost like a repeat of the James Callaghan crisis, what crisis situation, but relating to the National Health Service. And then he needs to take the actions that Labour's putting forward, use the spare capacity in the private sector now to get those backlogs down, and then let's scrap non-dom status, let's use the billions that would raise to fund and increase the numbers of nurses and doctors, and let's get those waiting lists down permanently and start treating patients.
Is it a problem, inconsistency, one might say, of Sir Keir Starmer's pronouncements on this issue? I mean, he did say end outsourcing in our NHS. Steve is saying you've got to be phlegmatic and practical about these things.
I think the crisis that we're facing at the moment is so dire that any solutions should be on the table, and I think that should be true for the government and for Labour. I think we do need a much longer-term conversation about the future of the NHS and the fact that so many of its problems are actually not healthcare problems, they're social care problems, they're problems in the cuts to community funding in all manner of areas that are coming through into frontline NHS services because of a decade of underfunding. That is a long-term conversation to have. At the moment, I feel like if the answer is we could spend this money, cut the backlog, get people discharged from hospital beds into sort of private social care places and just get through this winter, it would be quite ludicrous to not consider those options. I don't think we should let ideology get in the way of pragmatism, but then that longer conversation actually does need to happen, and I don't think any of the political parties currently are bold enough to do that.
I mean, it's £200 million, the extra that's been announced to try and help care homes provide extra beds to discharge more patients from hospital. I mean, that is a sticking plaster, as Labour has called it.
I think there is a difficulty in terms of trying to deal with, you know, the pressures that are on the NHS at the moment, and hoping that, you know, some money is going to get us through at this point in time. I agree with Rachel that actually we do need to take a step back and have a look at the whole of system approach, because one of the things that's missing from this argument this morning is that we've had a pandemic in the middle of this that has created an enormous amount of pressure and actually
But the arguments are that a lot of these problems, have exposed...
The pandemic has exposed some of the structural issues. Now, we also have to remember here that ministers actually are not in charge of the day-to-day running of the health service. That is done with organisations like NHS England and in various other groups and in trusts. So actually we need to get serious about the fact that espousing policy from Westminster is not actually going to get to the crux of how these things are run and how they can be changed. And it's a much more technocratic argument than we are allowing credit for.
I think that's a cop-out. I have to say that's
no,
a cop-out.
No, it's not a cop-out.
Because it's ministers decide
correct.
the level of funding,
yes,
and ministers decide the general approach. And there's not been a push towards prevention, which there should have been over the last decade.
But it doesn't necessarily translate into what you're seeing at the moment and what you listed in terms of ambulances not meeting times with having people on trolleys in hospitals. That is actually an operational function. Now, I'm not for 1 minute saying that there aren't policy decisions that need to be made here, but let's be clear about what crisis we're dealing with at what point in the chain.
Yes, and remember that the health service, we've obsessed about hospitals and buildings. We're running a national illness service, not a national health service, and we've got to look more seriously at early intervention, health and well-being, preventing these conditions from escalating in the
and
first
then maybe
place.
people say you should have done that over the last 12 years. But anyway, I think we're on our way to integrated healthcare already. The government's moving in that direction. There is a consensus here. We just need to be honest about it and have some of the technocratic conversations that Salma rightly identified. All right, well, let's talk about strikes because they are ongoing. Talks between government ministers and unions to avert further strikes are happening today with various sectors. The Prime Minister was asked about whether this year's pay settlement, and this year I mean 22 to 23, would be on the table in any discussions. This is what he said to Laura Kunsberg yesterday.
The first thing we need to do is start talking properly, and that's why Monday is really important. And we want to have these conversations. We want them to be honest. We want them to be...
But for clarity, will you talk about this year's pay deal on Monday with the unions?
So the most important thing is to be talking.
About this year's pay?
It wouldn't be right for me to sit here and start having negotiations in public with you or anyone else.
No, but forgive me, we have to be really clear about this, because up until now, government ministers have said that they will not discuss pay for this year. That's what people have been saying. Are you today saying something different? Are you saying, yes, let's talk about pay for this year?
The government has always been clear that it's happy to talk about pay that is responsible, that's affordable for the country. That's always been clear. But we have to look now. We're about to start a new pay settlement round for this year. Right, we're about to start that independent process, and before that process starts, the government is keen to sit down with the unions and talk about pay and make sure that they understand where we're coming from. That's why we've published very transparently all the evidence we have on what's affordable. But I'm just a bit confused about this, because I just want to be really, really clear. As a yes or no question, a yes or no answer, if you can, will you talk to nurses about increasing pay this year? Yes or no? We are about to start that process.
But that's about next year.
No, that's literally about the year that we're about to start.
Yes, Rishi Sunak talking to Laura Kunsberg about the negotiations. Well, funnily enough, on that same programme, the Royal College of Nursing General Secretary Pat Cullen seemed to think there was a chink of light in what Rishi Sunak was saying. Do you agree with her?
Well, yes, I do. I mean, I was watching that conversation carefully.
And were you confused?
Well, there's a difference between the financial year and the calendar year.
Right, so was he being deliberately disingenuous, the Prime Minister?
I don't know. That may well have been where they were. I mean, I've said, I've gone on the record and said that I think we need to find a middle way now. I think that nurses are under huge pressure. I think that finding some bespoke solution without trying to upend the entire independent pay review body mechanism, which I think is a job that won't solve the problem now. Some bespoke solution, I think, would be sensible.
Right. So
and that's what I hope will emerge.
You think nurses should be a special case?
I do.
And you think there should be a special case in terms of reopening? Did you get from that clip of Rishi Sunak that he would look at reopening this year's pay settlement?
Well, as I've said, I think trying to upend the recommendations of the independent pay review body is probably a task that will not be a task of moment. But there might be a particular solution that could help nurses now in this financial year ahead of any recommendation.
I'll come back to what you think that might look like. Do you think there's a chink of light? Do you think that Rishi Sunak was hinting in any way that that negotiations could be reopened for the settlement this financial year, so from April 22 to April 23?
Well, first off, it struck me as quite a laughable attempt to try and cover up another screeching U-turn, because we've had months, and I've been coming on your show and others, where Conservative ministers and the Prime Minister have said it would be wrong to sit down and have direct negotiations with the trade unions in the National Health Service, in the railways, to try and resolve this Conservative winter of discontent. And yet here we are yesterday, the Prime Minister, absolutely different possession, never said any of those things in the past, and today apparently they're going to meet. Well, we need to see whether those are genuine discussions, whether there's a real negotiation, or whether ministers are going to sit there with their arms folded and sucking their teeth. But, you know, if there is a chink, if they're going to sit down and do the things Labour's been saying all this time, then there is a chink of light. But there needs to be proposals on the table. We've said it's partly about pay, but it's also about terms and conditions and pressures. The non-dom issue is very critical here, because there's billions of pounds that could be taken and used to increase the numbers of nurses and doctors and reduce the pressure. And Labour's been advocating that for about a year now.
All right, well, you say there could be a chink of light, not according to this Unite negotiator that's just come out of meeting with ministers.
How did it go? Not well. Unfortunately, the government have missed yet another opportunity to put this right. We came here in good faith. What they want to talk about is productivity. Productivity, when our members are working 18-hour shifts, quite how you become more productive with that, I do not know. But today, unfortunately, despite us showing up in good faith, the government had missed yet another opportunity.
Disappointed, Robert?
Well, and Unite, I think, is representing paramedics. So a different dispute from the nurses themselves. It's concerning to hear that. I do think that both sides need to give a lot here. I hope that particular reaction isn't then reflective of a wider problem here, because I do think that communication and talking is what needs to happen.
What's wrong with reform, which is clearly what was being put on the table by the government ministers there?
Well, there does need to be reform, absolutely. We need to be moving towards prevention. That's what. But isn't it interesting that he came out there and he didn't talk about pay, he talked about 18-hour shifts. And this isn't just about money, it's about the pressure that our NHS workers are under. You know, I lost my dad in hospital last summer, and I spoke to some of the nurses that were looking after him and was astonished to find out they were working double shifts. I mean, I couldn't have had, I couldn't have been more in awe of the care and love that they were giving. But to make people work double shifts isn't fair. And
well, they've had enough, Robert, haven't they? I mean, people have just had enough of these sorts of conditions in the health service.
I know people under huge pressure, and there aren't enough in the workforce to cover everything that needs to be done, and that pressure is being felt as well, which is why I think the government is right to acknowledge this and to start talking.
Right, what do you think? Is there any optimism about strikes being averted? Both of you listening to what you just heard there from the Unite negotiator, and the way that Pat Cullen from the RCN interpreted Rishi Sunak's comments.
Well, I was quite heartened by the suggestion that maybe the compromise would be a one-off payment for this financial year, and the reason I found that sort of heartening was because both sides are treating this as though it's sort of a game of chicken, and whoever's toughest and whoever holds out the most wins. And if you can do anything to have some kind of compromise so they can both save face and say, we didn't give in on everything, but here's a solution, then that's obviously a constructive way forward. My worry is that government's attitude to this has been to talk very, very tough and to say, we're going to solve it all with legislation that will ban industrial action. That's our solution to stop these strikes going ahead. Well, you can stop strikes from going ahead. You can't force people to work in the health service if the pay isn't competitive and if the working conditions are so dire that they feel so burned out they can't continue to do that. So actually the government's position on it is going to make the staffing crisis worse.
Well, we're just hearing out of the lobby, which is where the Prime Minister spokesperson talks to journalists at Westminster, and they haven't ruled out this one-off payment. We can show you the headline in The Guardian that Rachel's been talking about. Prime Minister looks at one-off cash offer to end nurses' strike. Do you think that would work?
Oh, I hope so. I mean, that is a really good negotiating point. I think that is going to support the nurses who need that immediate
And that would be for this year, and then look at the pay settlement for next.
And then he can look at the next financial year. And I think it's really important, actually, to distinguish. It's something you just said, Rachel, on the strike legislation, to distinguish between something that is about economic productivity and also what you need for public servants who are under intense pressure in the health service. And I think this is an important way of making that distinction.
Would you support that, a one-off one-off payment to get a settlement for this year?
It's absolutely worth looking at something on the table, but you have to bear in mind, over the last 13 years, nurses have had a real terms pay cut of 20%. We all stood on our doorsteps and applauded them in the pandemic, including government ministers. And now this year, when the pressures on them are so intense, they're being offered another 5% real terms pay cut. And no wonder, tragically, National Health Service staff are leaving it in droves. 7,000 doctors this year applied for a permit to work overseas. A quarter of them go to Australia. Now, what are we doing to our NHS under this government?
Would you support a one-off payment?
Yes, I would. I think then it avoids having to upend the whole structure, which will take ages, and it deals with the problem now. And on minimum service levels, let's not forget the Royal College of Nurses undertook to provide those minimum service levels when they went on strike. I think that issue is totally divorced from particularly the nurses' case.
I don't think it's divorced when that's what the government's line is. We want to end the strikes, so we will pass legislation to end these strikes. That has been the government message.
But the legislation wouldn't be about that. It would be about minimum service levels, which was a manifesto commitment in the transport sector. I think the government, if it should focus very much upon what it said in the manifesto, deliver something reasonable that I think the public would support. This isn't about and in fact, it wouldn't have retrospective effects. It wouldn't affect the current disputes, but it would allow, I think, the balance to be struck well in the future in favour of minimum inconvenience and sometimes life-threatening inconvenience to the public.
Well, the nurses, to be fair to them, already did that, and I think it's very provocative in the middle of a situation like this for the government to come out with a proposal that if you follow it through to its logical conclusion, means the government would be sacking nurses at a time when we've got a crisis in our NHS.
Dealt with that
what is the benefit of doing
well,
that?
I think the two issues are divorced. I think the minimum service levels argument relates to the transport sector, and I don't think this is about an attack on nurses at all.
We've never had a strike in our NHS before this, ever in its entire history.
Which is why I agree, and this is why I think we should be taking a middle way and finding a solution to help our hard-pressed nurses. Well, I think
actually maybe they are now with that lobby briefing.
Well, and just before we move on, you say there should be a bespoke settlement for nurses. Is that realistic when you've got all these other sectors also possibly out on strike? We could be looking at teacher strikes too, to give one sector a particular pay deal for next year. Let's say it was around 10% and not others.
I think it's politically possibly a logical move, given the NHS crisis and given that is the thing that people are most worried about and also have the most sympathy for healthcare workers as opposed to people in other areas. But you still run into the same problems, which is if you're not paying people who work in your public services enough, they will find jobs elsewhere. You will continue to have staffing shortages. You will struggle to recruit, and public services will continue to crumble and continue to get worse. And you can't sort of change that by sort of rhetoric and this attitude of we're just going to be really tough. You know, you're still going to have those fundamental structural problems.
There's a bigger problem underneath all of this, which is the fact that the government's failed to grow the economy, so there's not enough money to fund the public services that we need. You know, the economy grew 50% more every single year under the last Labour government than this Tory government, and we've got the chairman of Tesco saying that there's only one player on the pitch when it comes to economic growth, and that's Labour, and he's not a natural Labour supporter. So the government losing grip of the economy underpins a lot of this, but we need to fund...
Well, I'll let you... The Labour years ended with a 6% contraction in the economy.
Well, I remember as well that we didn't have waiting lists in the NHS.
Well, let's not do ancient history, as it seems.
You know, the government, we've been presiding over economic growth, and growth has been providing the resources for our public services.
We've had the lowest growth of the 38 members of the OECD.
Why do we inject 34 billion into the health service since 2019? I mean, you can't ignore the reality that this government has presided over record amounts of investment in our National Health Service.
All right, we're going to pause there because we're going to talk about energy prices. As you know, households and businesses have been struggling with rising bills and have received some help from the government. In a moment, we're going to be talking to business owner Jo Bevilacqua. She runs a hair and beauty salon in Peterborough. We'll come to you in just a moment. But I just want to show you this headline in The Guardian, because we're going to talk about this first, which is why are wholesale gas prices falling and, importantly, will it cut UK bills? Let's ask Dara Vyas, Deputy CEO of Energy UK, the trade association of the energy industry. Hello to you. Why are prices falling now?
Afternoon. So it's a good question, and it's a completely legitimate question to be asking. I think the first thing to note is that energy is still actually quite expensive. It's definitely not, we've not returned to the prices we were seeing 18 months ago. And although wholesale gas prices are now below what they were before Russia invaded Ukraine, they're still historically high. Now, the reason we don't see that go straight through to bills is because actually suppliers buy in advance, and you want and expect them to, so that you have certainty in pricing. And so that's called hedging. So when you're buying in advance, they'll have bought at prices from 3 to 6 months ago. So there is a lag, there is a time lag to when prices will change for retail customers. They don't change overnight. So when wholesale energy prices did start to rise back in August, September 2021, there was a lag before it fed through to consumer bills in sort of 21, 22, where customers were paying significantly less than the spot price. So it does work both ways.
Right. So can we expect prices to come down in the near future? Could you give us a sort of ballpark, not overnight, but maybe in the next few months?
So I think, I think this is potentially good news, but we do need to see a sustained fall. And whilst analysts are predicting lower prices, they've also said it is too soon to predict what will happen to bills going forward. There is a lot of uncertainty, and that's because, we are still going through, Russia's still invading Ukraine. We've also seen the end of zero COVID in China, and that's going to change it's going to change economic activity and gas prices.
Dara, just stay with us. Jo, listening to that, how does that make you feel? Dara's saying that actually we've got to see sustained falls, however long that may have to actually carry on for, before it would be fed into our bills.
Yeah, I think as a small business owner, it's the lack of uncertainty that we've been facing for the last kind of nearly 3 years now, with everything that's been hit at us. And I know every single other business owner, as well as myself, is exhausted from every obstacle that we're trying to face with very little control. For myself, looking at our contract is at the end of April, so does that leave us in good stead, maybe, from what's been said today? But who knows? It all just seems a bit of a gamble. We're looking at increasing our prices anyway due to kind of the national living wage going up and all the other bills that we've had going up. And it's, do we try and commit to something now at the prices that they are now, or do we kind of hold our nerve and wait until nearer to April to then commit to a new contract? It's just all the uncertainty is very difficult for us, because looking at, I'm lucky enough to have a broker that's been looking at the markets for us. And just this morning, with the quotes that he's giving us, if we were to sign up today at today's prices, even though they have fallen over the weekend, our gas is still looking 4 times more expensive than what we're paying at the moment. And our electricity is 3 times the amount.
I mean, Dara, can you offer any advice to Jo about what she should do at this point?
I mean, I think that on the business side of things, there is the energy bill relief scheme that the government's put in, and we are actually expecting an announcement from government, possibly today, but certainly this week, on the future of that relief scheme post-spring. I completely understand it's a business-to-business transaction when energy suppliers are supplying businesses and small businesses, and so therefore, working through a broker is definitely an option. Lots of people do take up. Prices are higher than they were before, and I completely see her point of view. It is very different to the domestic household market, where we've got the price cap, which makes it slightly easier to support customers, I think.
Right, and actually, Jo, perhaps you could tell our viewers, what help have you had from the government, if any? None, it looks like.
We signed our contract 3 years ago. And what I've been told by the broker is that the help was only for contracts that were agreed in 2022. So we've actually not any help whatsoever.
And have you managed to hold on to all your staff?
Not all, no. It's really difficult industry. We've lost, from the first pandemic, from the first lockdown, we lost a majority. After each and every lockdown, we lost more and more staff.
Yes.
For the uncertainty, we try and pay our staff over and above what maybe other hair salons are able to pay theirs. But our whole industry is in a bit of a mess.
Yes.
Quite a big salon, so we pay VAT. There's only 35% of salons that actually have an employee-based business.
Well, Jo, I've got a Conservative MP, former minister, here in the studio. I mean, Jo's had no help at all with the business. Does that surprise you?
Well, I think the scheme was designed to help particular firms that had gone into contracts at a time when rises were, quite dramatic. And I think, it's an unfortunate reality for Jo and other businesses like hers that she's about to renew her contract at a time of much higher prices, and therefore I think it's really incumbent on the government when they come out with their announcement about the future of the scheme after March to address the high need, high energy use businesses like Jo's and those businesses like Jo's that are having to enter into new dramatically higher contracts. And also with businesses, very often they have to pay big upfront costs on these contracts. So the way it's structured, I think, is a real problem for a lot of businesses. And I think Ofgem need to step up far more aggressively and deal with some of these problems that businesses are facing now.
Right, the cliff edge, as we know, it's coming at the beginning of April, end of March, and it's been delayed or postponed, the government announcement about which sectors, which industries would continue to get some sort of help, taking it that Jo's hasn't had any for the reasons that she's explained. What would Labour do on April the 1st for businesses? Continue the scheme that is in place or not?
Well, first off, the continuing delays are really damaging to small... I've been speaking to small businesses like the one we've been hearing from.
But what would you do? I mean, we know that. I mean, I've said that there's been a delay. It's coming this week. But what would you do come April if Labour was in power in terms of energy-intensive industries or business in general?
Well, in terms of energy-intensive business, Labour's already announced a £1 billion contingency fund that was properly funded and accounted for to help those businesses that are struggling the most. Right. But there's more support that we should be giving to particularly high street businesses that are really struggling. And we've for a long time now been proposing scrapping business rates and replacing it with an online digital sales tax so that the online giants pay their fair share. That would reduce the cost to an average small business by £5,000 a year, which I imagine at a time of such uncertainty would be very welcome, but might even save some of those small businesses from going under.
Jo, what do you make of what you've heard from both politicians, Conservative and Labour?
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine all the things that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, don't worry too much about them.
I just don't think it's enough. Every time I log on to social media, I'm in lots of different groups of hair salon owners, and every day there is somebody selling off their stock or trying to sell their business because it's just not feasible. And I think looking at the numbers, are we going to be another victim of increased energy costs and all the other things that are put on us? Because actually we have to pay our staff well, we have to pay our bills. Yes. And the only way to do that is to keep increasing our prices. And are we then going to price ourselves out of the market when people can just go to somebody else's house and have a haircut maybe done at half the price?
All right, Jo, I'm just going to ask our other guests just to respond to Jo's situation, and it won't be isolated, of course, and what the government should do when they make this announcement about continued support for businesses. It's going to be vastly reduced. I think we can all agree on that. Should it be?
I think, having spoken to business leaders in my sort of previous role, the key thing that I was told again and again and again is it's not actually always about the level of support, it's about the certainty, and it's about getting really clear guidelines and also making the process really easy to use. And it does seem that in this circumstance, the government sort of hasn't been prepared for that, and the continuing uncertainty, maybe a couple of weeks doesn't matter that much when you're a minister. When you're a small business owner, it is the difference between laying off staff and not doing so.
Well, it seems a bit late in the day.
Well, I think it's difficult for them because they're going to have to work out which is the greater priority. I mean, we've just spent the last segment talking about strikes, and any kind of one-off payment is going to cost. So they're going to have to balance that against what they might have still available in the kitty to go towards energy. Now, if you're focused on growth, which this government is supposed to be, there is an argument to suggest that actually they do need to do a little bit more for small businesses to be able to extend that support. And you're right, certainty is the absolute critical factor.
And speed as well, because I was speaking to my businesses in my patch. At this point, even if you've got a broker, because some businesses, if energy costs rocket in the way that they would do if there wasn't support, become unviable. They can't get the good deals even if they're available. So we really need the government to bring this forward and let businesses know now what's going to happen so that they can plan.
Jo, did you want to say something? Oh,
at the end,
yeah, go on.
The government help is great, don't get me wrong, and it saved so many business over COVID with all the stuff that they did for us. But actually, why are we going to be taking more of the government money, which is obviously quite strained at the moment, and there are different priorities, to pay the energy companies to allow us to have a discount on them. Why are they not taxing? Why are these energy...
Well, that's a good point. And very briefly, Robert Buckland's going to try and answer it for us. Why aren't they?
I think Jo makes a really powerful point. I think, let's all forget the government already imposes a windfall tax, and indeed the rate of corporation tax is higher for the oil and gas companies than average. But I think it's also important to reiterate the point I made about Ofgem. We really need to reform the way that contracts for businesses are being applied. It's really...
All right, and on that, I'm going to say thank you to both Jo and Dara for that, and all of my guests here today. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye-bye.